He wasn't supposed to stop there. Not in the middle of a routine patrol where nothing ever changed and the forest kept its secrets buried beneath damp earth and time. But Rex did stop, his body going rigid like a statue carved from instinct rather than flesh. His amber eyes locked onto something no one else could see as the early morning fog clung low between the trees, and the scent of wet bark and decaying leaves filled the air like an old memory that refused to fade. And Officer Ethan Walker felt it immediately, that subtle shift in the silence, the kind that didn't announce itself with sound but with absence, because even the birds had gone quiet, and Rex, his German Shepherd partner of 4 years, wasn't just alert. He was unsettled in a way Ethan had only seen once before, back during a search operation that ended in a discovery no one forgot. "Easy, boy," Ethan murmured under his breath, his voice calm but edged with something deeper, something cautious, as he stepped closer, boots sinking slightly into the soft ground that still held last night's rain. But Rex didn't respond the way he usually did, didn't glance back for reassurance or wait for command. Instead, he let out a low bark, sharp and deliberate, aimed directly at the trunk of an old tree standing alone just off the narrow trail. Its bark swollen in one place like a scar that had grown over something it shouldn't have, the surface uneven, darker than the rest, and strangely smooth in patches as if time itself had tried to seal whatever lay beneath it. Ethan narrowed his eyes, scanning the tree from top to bottom. Nothing moved. No insects, no signs of recent damage. Just that unnatural bulge about 4 feet off the ground, roughly the size of a small duffel bag. And Rex stepped closer, paws pressing into the mud as he sniffed, then pawed at the base with urgency that bordered on desperation, his breathing uneven now, a soft whine slipping between his teeth like he was trying to communicate something words could never hold. "Rex," Ethan called again, firmer this time. But the dog didn't back off, didn't break focus. Instead, he circled once, then returned to the exact same spot, nose pressed to the bark, tail stiff, ears forward, every line of his body drawn tight with purpose. And that's when Ethan felt it. Not fear exactly, but a pull, something quiet and persistent telling him this wasn't random, that whatever had stopped Rex here wasn't chance, because dogs like Rex didn't make mistakes, not like this, not with that look in their eyes, the kind that said they were following something older than training, older than commands, something that came from a place even humans struggled to understand. Ethan exhaled slowly, the cool air brushing against his skin as he reached down to unclip the small utility blade from his belt, the metal catching a faint glint of filtered sunlight breaking through the canopy above. And for a moment he hesitated, his mind running through protocol, through logic, through every reason to dismiss this as nothing more than an overreaction. But Rex let out another bark, louder this time, echoing faintly through the trees, and that hesitation slipped away, replaced by something quieter but stronger, trust, the kind built over years of silent communication and shared moments that didn't need explanation. Ethan stepped closer to the tree, raising the blade, his hand steady even as his heartbeat shifted just slightly, enough to remind him that this moment mattered, that whatever lay beneath that warped bark wasn't meant to be found easily. The forest seemed to lean in around him, the fog thickening just enough to blur the edges of the world, beyond this single point in space. And Rex lowered himself slightly, not in fear, but in anticipation, as if he knew what was coming even before the first cut was made. And Ethan pressed the blade against the surface, the bark giving way with a soft crack, revealing wood beneath that was darker than it should have been, aged in a way that didn't match the rest of the tree. And as he drew the blade downward, slow and careful, something in the air shifted again, subtle but undeniable, like a door opening somewhere far beneath the surface of things, and Rex let out a low, trembling sound, not a bark this time, but something deeper, something that carried weight, as if whatever had brought them here was finally about to be seen. And for a brief second, before the cut went deeper, Ethan realized one thing with absolute clarity: Rex hadn't stopped here by accident, and whatever waited inside that tree had been waiting a long time for someone to listen. The blade sank deeper with a dull, resistant scrape, not the hollow sound of dead wood, but something denser, something layered, and Ethan felt it through his grip, like a faint vibration traveling up his arm, as if the tree itself carried a memory that did not want to be disturbed. And he paused for half a second, just enough to hear Rex shift beside him, claws pressing into the soil. A soft whine building in his chest that rose and fell like a warning carried on breath rather than sound. "It is. All right," Ethan whispered, though he was no longer sure if he was speaking to the dog or to himself. And then he pulled the blade free and widened the cut, peeling back a section of bark that cracked and curled away with age, revealing a darker inner layer that looked less like wood and more like something preserved, sealed off from time. And the air changed again, a faint scent slipping through that did not belong to the forest, not rot, not earth, but something older, something still, and Rex lowered his head closer, nose hovering inches from the opening, trembling slightly as if he recognized it without understanding why, and Ethan swallowed, his throat tightening just enough to make him aware of his own breathing, slow, controlled, the way it had been trained to stay even when the world shifted around him. And he reached forward with his gloved hand, brushing aside the loosened fragments, careful, deliberate, revealing a narrow cavity hidden within the trunk, not large, not obvious, but intentional, carved by something more than nature. And for a moment there was nothing inside but shadow, a darkness that seemed to absorb the light filtering through the branches above, and Rex let out a low sound, almost a murmur, and leaned closer, his body no longer tense but heavy, weighted with something that felt like recognition, and Ethan angled himself slightly, letting the light catch the interior just enough to reveal the outline of something wrapped, something placed rather than grown, and his pulse shifted again, not faster, but deeper, each beat carrying more awareness than the last. And he set the blade down carefully against the base of the tree, choosing instead to use his hands, slower now, more respectful of whatever he was uncovering. And as he reached in, the coolness inside the hollow brushed against his skin through the glove, a stillness untouched by the outside world, and his fingers met fabric, rough and worn, folded with intention, and he paused again, glancing at Rex, whose eyes were fixed not on the object but on Ethan himself, as if waiting, as if this moment belonged to both of them. And with a steady breath Ethan began to pull the bundle forward, inch by inch, careful not to disturb its shape, until the edge emerged into the light, revealing a muted color, faded with time. Something once bright now softened into memory, and Rex exhaled sharply, a sound that carried both tension and release. And when the bundle came free enough for Ethan to see it clearly, he froze, not in fear, but in recognition of something that did not fit the place or the moment, because it was not random, not debris, not forgotten trash. It was deliberate, preserved, hidden with purpose, and Ethan shifted his grip, holding it gently now, almost instinctively careful, as if whatever rested inside deserved more than just discovery. And for a long second neither he nor Rex moved, the forest holding its breath around them, until a faint breeze slipped through the branches, brushing across the opening, carrying with it the quiet realization that whatever had been sealed inside this tree had waded through seasons, through storms, through silence. And Rex lowered himself fully to the ground beside Ethan, not in submission, not in rest, but in something closer to presence, as if he had finally reached the place he was meant to find. And Ethan looked down at the bundle in his hands, then back at the hollow in the tree, and understood one simple truth with a clarity that settled deep in his chest. This was not the end of what Rex had found. It was only the beginning of something that had been waiting far longer than either of them had been alive. The weight of the bundle felt wrong in Ethan's hands, not heavy in the way of mass, but in the way certain objects carried something unseen, something that settled into your chest before your mind could name it. And he slowly lowered himself onto one knee beside the tree, the damp earth pressing through the fabric of his uniform as the forest remained unnaturally still around them, as if even the wind had chosen not to interfere. And Rex stayed close, his body angled toward Ethan, his breathing steady now but deep, each inhale deliberate, each exhale soft, like he was grounding himself in something only he could sense. And Ethan glanced at him briefly, searching for the usual cues, the trained signals, but there were none, only that quiet presence, that unwavering focus that said this moment mattered beyond protocol, beyond reason, and with careful hands Ethan began to unfold the fabric. Each layer stiff with age yet preserved enough to hold its shape, the texture rough beneath his fingers as if it had been wrapped with purpose, not haste, and the faint scent that rose from it was neither foul nor fresh, just distant, like something that had been sealed away from time itself. And as the final fold loosened, a small object slipped slightly into view, catching a fragment of light that broke through the canopy above, and Ethan stilled, his breath catching just enough to mark the shift, because what rested inside was not random, not forgotten, it was intentional, a personal belonging, something that once meant something to someone, and he adjusted the fabric gently, revealing more, and the outline became clearer, edges defined by years but still recognizable, and Rex lowered his head closer, not touching, just watching, his ears slightly back now, not in fear, but in something quieter, something that resembled respect, and Ethan felt it too, that unspoken understanding that whatever this was, it had not been hidden to be lost, it had been hidden to be found. Eventually, by someone who would not ignore it, and he swallowed again, his throat dry despite the damp air, and his eyes moved between the object and the hollow behind him, connecting the silence of the forest with the stillness of what he now held. And for a brief moment his mind reached for explanation, for logic, but it slipped away just as quickly, replaced by something more instinctive, something that mirrored the way Rex had stopped without being told, had known without being shown. And Ethan realized then that this was not about what the object was, but why it had been placed here, why it had been sealed within the body of a tree that had grown around it, protecting it through years no one had counted. And a faint breeze moved through again, brushing against the leaves above, creating a soft whisper that carried no words yet felt like it held meaning, and Rex shifted closer, his shoulder pressing lightly against Ethan's leg, grounding him in the present, reminding him he was not alone in this moment. And Ethan placed one hand gently over the object, not to hide it, but to steady himself, his fingers resting there as if acknowledging something unseen. And in that quiet, suspended second, he understood that whatever story this tree had kept hidden was not finished, not yet, because the way Rex had found it, the way the forest had held it, it all pointed to something larger than chance, something that did not reveal itself all at once, but in pieces, in moments like this, where silence spoke louder than any explanation ever could. And Ethan drew a slow breath, lifting his gaze toward the path they had come from, then back to the tree, and finally down to Rex, whose eyes met his with a calm that felt almost human. And without a single word exchanged, Ethan made a choice, not as an officer following procedure, but as a man listening to something deeper, something that had led them here for a reason. And he carefully gathered the bundle in his hands, rising to his feet with measured movement, aware now that what he carried was more than just an object. It was a beginning, a thread that had waited patiently to be followed, and Rex stood with him immediately. No hesitation, no command needed. His posture aligned once more with purpose, but different now, less urgent, more certain, as if the first step had already been taken. And as they turned slightly away from the tree, the hollow behind them seemed darker than before, not empty, but completed, like a chapter quietly closing as another prepared to unfold. And neither of them looked back, because some things, once found, do not need to be seen again to be understood. The path back felt different, though nothing in the forest had changed, the same narrow trail winding between tall pines, the same damp scent rising from the earth. Yet each step Ethan took carried a quiet weight now, the bundle secured carefully in his hands as if it might shift or vanish if he moved too quickly. And Rex walked slightly ahead, but not with urgency anymore, his pace measured, his ears occasionally flicking back as if checking that Ethan was still there, still following, still understanding, and the silence between them was no longer empty. It was full, layered with something unspoken that stretched beyond training and command. And after a few minutes Ethan slowed, glancing down again at what he carried, the fabric still folded loosely around the object within, its edges worn but intact, and he felt that same pull again, that quiet insistence that he needed to look closer, not later, not back at the station, but here, in the place where it had been found, where whatever story it held still lingered in the air. And he stopped completely, boots settling into the soft ground as Rex immediately turned and returned to his side, sitting down without being told, his posture calm but attentive, and Ethan knelt once more, resting the bundle across his knee, his fingers moving slower this time, more deliberate, as if he understood that what he was about to uncover was not meant to be rushed. And as he peeled back another fold, the object beneath became clearer, its surface catching the muted light, worn but unmistakably crafted, something made by human hands, something that had once been held, carried, perhaps even cherished, and Ethan's breath steadied as he adjusted the fabric further, revealing details that spoke quietly of time, of use, of purpose, and he felt a faint tightening in his chest, not from fear, but from recognition of meaning, the kind that did not come from knowing exactly what something was, but from understanding that it mattered, deeply, to someone, once. And Rex leaned slightly closer, his nose hovering near but not touching, his gaze fixed in a way that felt almost reverent, as if he too sensed the weight of what lay before them. And Ethan exhaled slowly, his mind working through possibilities, through fragments of logic that tried to place the object into a category, evidence, artifact, lost property, but none of them felt right. Not here, not like this. And he realized then that this was not just something that had been hidden, it was something that had been protected, intentionally placed within the living body of a tree that had grown around it, sealing it away from weather, from time, from the world itself. And the question shifted in his mind from what it was to who had done this, and why. And the forest seemed to respond in its own quiet way, a soft rustle moving through the leaves above, the kind that carried no direction, no source, just presence. And Rex lowered himself onto his front legs, resting there beside Ethan, not restless, not alert, but steady, grounded, as if this moment was not about discovery alone, but about connection. And Ethan let his hand rest briefly on the object again, feeling its surface through the thin layer of fabric, and in that simple contact he felt something settle inside him, a clarity that this was not coincidence, that Rex had not simply stumbled upon this place, and that whatever had led them here was not finished revealing itself. And he lifted his gaze, scanning the surrounding trees, the subtle differences in bark, in growth, in shadow, wondering if this tree had always stood apart or if it had become so because of what it carried. And for a moment he considered marking the location, calling it in, following standard procedure, but the thought felt distant, almost secondary, because this moment belonged first to understanding, to listening, to letting the story reveal itself in its own time. And Rex's tail gave a slow, single movement against the ground, not excitement, not distraction, just acknowledgement, as if confirming what Ethan had begun to feel, that they were exactly where they were meant to be. And Ethan carefully rewrapped the object, not to hide it again, but to hold it together, to preserve its condition until he could learn more. And as he rose once more, the forest seemed to shift subtly around them, the light breaking through in thin strands, illuminating the path ahead in a way it had not before. And Rex stood immediately, aligning himself at Ethan's side, his presence steady and certain, and together they began to move again, not just away from the tree, but toward something still unseen, something waiting quietly at the edge of understanding, just beyond the reach of what either of them could yet fully grasp. The trail curved gently downhill, guiding them toward the faint outline of a service road nearly half a mile ahead. And with each step Ethan felt the quiet weight of the bundle grow more defined, not heavier in mass but clearer in meaning, as if proximity to whatever came next was sharpening its presence. And Rex moved with a different rhythm now, no longer scanning the forest for threats, but following a line only he seemed to understand, his head low, his pace steady, and every so often he would pause just long enough to glance back, not questioning, not waiting, simply ensuring that Ethan remained part of the path they were now sharing. And the silence between them deepened into something almost intentional, a kind of agreement that words would only disrupt what was unfolding. And when they reached the edge of the tree line, where the forest gave way to a narrow gravel road bordered by tall grass swaying gently in the morning light, Ethan stopped again, not out of uncertainty, but because something in the air shifted once more, subtle but unmistakable, like stepping across an invisible boundary between what had been hidden and what was about to be revealed. and Rex halted beside him, his ears lifting slightly, his body alert again but not tense, more aware than reactive, and Ethan looked down at the bundle, then out toward the road, where faint tire tracks cut through the gravel, old but still visible. Lines that suggested movement, passage, a connection between this isolated place and something beyond it. And he felt the question form more clearly now, not just who had hidden the object, but where they had come from, and why this place had been chosen. And as if responding to that thought, Rex stepped forward a few paces onto the gravel, lowering his nose to the ground, tracing the faded tracks with quiet determination, his movements slower than before, deliberate, careful, as though he was not searching for something new, but confirming something already known. And Ethan followed, his boots crunching softly against the gravel, the sound oddly loud in the open space compared to the muffled silence of the forest, and he crouched slightly, watching Rex's behavior, noting the subtle shifts, the pauses, the small adjustments that spoke of instinct rather than training. And after a moment Rex stopped, lifting his head and looking down the road to the right, his gaze fixed on a point far beyond what could be clearly seen, and Ethan felt that same pull. Again, stronger this time, guiding his attention in the same direction, and without hesitation he rose fully and turned, aligning himself with Rex's focus, and together they began walking along the road, the forest now at their backs, the open sky above carrying a pale morning light that stretched long shadows across their path, and the world felt wider here, less enclosed, but no less quiet, as if whatever story had begun in that tree was now extending outward, revealing its next piece in a place where movement, not stillness, held the answers. And after several minutes the outline of something ahead began to take shape, faint at first, then clearer with each step, a structure partially obscured by overgrown brush, its edges softened by time, but still standing, still present. And Rex's pace slowed again as they approached, his body lowering slightly, not in fear, but in awareness, as if he recognized this place in the same way he had recognized the tree, not through sight alone but through something deeper, something carried within him. And Ethan's chest tightened just enough to mark the moment, his breath steady but more focused now, as he took in the details, the worn wood, the weathered surface, the quiet stillness that surrounded the structure. And he knew without needing to say it that this was not coincidence, that the path from the tree to this place was not random, and that whatever lay ahead was connected to what he carried in his hands. And Rex stopped just short of the structure, turning his head slightly toward Ethan, his eyes calm but intent, as if to say this was as far as instinct could lead, and what came next would require something more. And Ethan stepped forward alone, closing the final distance with measured steps, the gravel crunching softly beneath his boots. And as he reached the edge of the structure, the air seemed to still once more, the same quiet pressure settling around him like a held breath, and he lowered his gaze briefly to the bundle, then lifted it slightly, almost unconsciously, as if bringing it closer to the place it belonged. And in that moment, standing between what had been hidden and what was now waiting to be understood, Ethan realized that the story was no longer just something he had found. It was something he had stepped into, something that had chosen to be uncovered, piece by piece, until the truth could no longer remain unseen. The structure stood quiet and weathered, its wooden frame grayed by years of sun and rain, the boards slightly warped but still holding their shape like a memory that refused to disappear. And Ethan slowed his steps as he approached, the bundle steady in his hands, his eyes tracing the outline of what looked like an old ranger's shed or hunting cabin, long abandoned but not forgotten, at least not by whatever force had led Rex here. And the tall grass around it brushed softly in the breeze, whispering against the sides of the building as if trying to speak in a language too subtle to understand. And Rex remained a few yards behind, watching, not moving forward this time, his posture grounded, as though he had reached the edge of something that now belonged to Ethan alone. And Ethan felt that separation clearly, not as distance, but as a shift in responsibility, and he stepped onto the small wooden porch, the boards creaking faintly under his weight, the sound echoing, just enough to remind him how quiet everything else had become. And he paused at the door, his hand hovering near the handle, not out of fear but out of respect, as if this place deserved a moment of acknowledgement before being entered. and the bundle in his hands seemed to draw him closer, a silent pull aligning his movement with purpose. And when he finally pushed the door open, it gave with a soft resistance, the hinges groaning quietly as the interior revealed itself in dim, filtered light, dust hanging in the air like suspended time. And Ethan stepped inside slowly, his eyes adjusting, taking in the small, simple space. A single table against the far wall, a chair tipped slightly to one side, shelves mostly empty but not entirely bare, and the faint scent of aged wood mixed with something else, something faint but familiar, like the echo of a presence that had not fully faded. And he closed the door gently behind him, not to shut the world out, but to hold the moment in place. And for a second he simply stood there, listening, the quiet pressing in around him, not heavy, not threatening, just present. And then his gaze moved to the table, where something rested near the edge, partially covered in dust, but still visible, and his chest tightened slightly as recognition brushed against him. Not clear, not complete, but enough to make him step forward. And as he approached, the bundle in his hands seemed to belong there, as if the space itself had been waiting for its return. And he set it down carefully on the table, the fabric brushing against the worn surface with a soft sound that carried more meaning than volume. And Rex, outside, let out a single low bark, not loud, not urgent, but deliberate, as if marking the moment from a distance. And Ethan glanced briefly toward the door, then back to the table, and his hands moved again, slower now, unfolding the fabric once more, revealing the object fully for the first time within this space. And something about the room seemed to respond, not with movement, but with presence, as if the air itself had shifted to acknowledge what had been brought back. And Ethan exhaled quietly, his mind no longer searching for answers in the usual way, but opening instead to the possibility that this place and this object were connected in ways that could not be traced by simple logic. And he reached out, adjusting the position slightly, aligning it with the edge of the table, almost instinctively placing it where it felt right. And as he did, his eyes caught another detail, something carved faintly into the wood near the corner of the table, worn but still legible, initials perhaps, or a mark left behind by someone who had once stood here. And Ethan leaned closer, his focus narrowing, and in that moment the quiet deepened once more, not empty, not silent, but full of something waiting just beneath the surface, something that had been patient for years, for seasons, for time itself. And now, with the return of what had been hidden, it felt closer than ever to being understood. The faint carving near the corner of the table drew Ethan closer, his fingers brushing lightly across the worn surface as if touch might reveal what time had tried to erase. And as he leaned in, the letters became clearer, not perfectly preserved but still legible enough to hold meaning. Two initials carved with care rather than haste, the edges softened by years yet deliberate in their form. And Ethan felt something shift again, not in the room, but within his understanding, because this was no longer just a place where something had been left behind. It was a place where someone had once stayed, had once existed long enough to mark it, to claim it in some quiet, personal way. And Rex, outside, shifted his weight, the faint sound of his movement carrying through the thin wooden walls, grounding Ethan in the present even as his mind reached backward into something unseen. And he straightened slightly, his gaze moving from the carving back to the object on the table, the two now connected by more than proximity, by intention, by a thread that was beginning to take shape. And he exhaled slowly, his breath stirring the thin layer of dust that settled again almost immediately, as if reluctant to be disturbed. And with careful hands he adjusted the object once more, turning it just enough to catch the light from the narrow window, revealing details that had been hidden before, subtle markings, signs of wear that spoke of use, of time spent in someone's possession rather than something discarded or forgotten. And Ethan's chest tightened again, not with tension but with recognition of significance, the kind that did not need explanation to be understood. And he glanced toward the shelves along the wall, his eyes scanning the sparse contents. A few scattered items left behind, nothing of immediate value, but each one placed with a kind of quiet order that suggested this space had not been abandoned in chaos, but in stillness, in decision. And that thought lingered as he stepped closer, his boots soft against the wooden floor, and reached toward one of the shelves where a small object rested near the back, partially hidden in shadow, and when he lifted it, the dust fell away in a thin cascade, revealing something simple yet familiar, something that did not belong to the forest or to time, but to a person, and he held it there for a moment, comparing its presence to what lay on the table, and the connection deepened, not fully clear but undeniable, like pieces of a story beginning to align without needing to be forced. And outside, Rex let out another low sound, softer this time, almost like a breath released, and Ethan turned slightly toward the door, sensing that whatever Rex felt was tied to what was happening inside, that this discovery was not isolated but shared, even if the understanding came differently to each of them. And he stepped back toward the table, placing the newly found item beside the one he had uncovered in the tree, and for a moment he simply stood there, looking at them together, the distance between past and present narrowing into something tangible, something real, and the room seemed to hold that moment with quiet acceptance, as if this was always meant to happen, always meant to come together in this place. And Ethan felt a calm settle over him, not the calm of resolution, but the calm of direction, the sense that the path forward was beginning to reveal itself, piece by piece, guided not by certainty, but by trust, the same trust that had led him to follow Rex without question, and he reached out once more, resting his hand briefly on the table, on the worn wood, on the space that had held these things long before he arrived. And in that simple gesture there was acknowledgement, respect for the story that had unfolded here before him. And as he lifted his hand again, his eyes moved once more to the carved initials, now clearer in his mind. Not just marks, but a signature of presence, of someone who had once stood in this same space and left behind more than just objects. And Ethan understood then that this was not just about what had been found, but about who had left it, and why. And that answer was closer now than it had been before, waiting quietly in the details, in the connections, in the silent guidance of a dog who had known where to stop long before any human could have seen the reason. The two objects resting side by side on the worn wooden table seemed to settle into place as if they had always belonged together, the space between them no longer empty, but filled with something quiet and complete. And Ethan stood there, unmoving for a long moment, his eyes shifting between the details, the edges, the subtle signs of time that spoke not just of age but of intention, because nothing about this felt accidental anymore. Not the tree, not the carving, not this cabin hidden just far enough from the road to be forgotten by most, but remembered by something deeper. And he reached out slowly, his fingers brushing lightly across the surface of the second item he had found on the shelf, then back to the one he had carried from the tree, tracing the connection not through logic but through instinct, the same instinct that had guided Rex to that exact spot without hesitation. And as his hand rested there, something aligned in his mind, not as a sudden realization, but as a quiet understanding that unfolded gently, like a memory returning rather than a discovery being made. And outside, Rex shifted again, the faint sound of his movement carrying through the door, followed by a soft, almost inaudible whine, not of distress, but of recognition, as if he too felt the shift, the nearing of something that had been waiting to be completed. And Ethan turned slightly, his gaze moving toward the doorway, then back to the table. And in that moment he understood that whatever this story was, it did not belong only to the past. It had reached into the present through Rex, through instinct, through something passed down or carried forward in ways no one could fully explain. And he lifted the edge of the fabric again, exposing more of the object beneath, this time with less hesitation, as if he was no longer uncovering something unknown but returning something to its rightful place. And the details became clearer now, shapes and markings that spoke quietly of identity, of belonging. And Ethan felt his chest tighten once more, not from confusion, but from the weight of meaning settling into something real, something undeniable. And he looked again at the carving on the table, the initials worn but steady, and then back to the objects. And the connection completed itself, not loudly, not dramatically, but with the kind of certainty that left no room for doubt. And for a brief second he closed his eyes, not to escape the moment, but to hold it, to let it fully settle before moving forward. And when he opened them again, the room felt different, not changed, but acknowledged. as if it had been waiting for someone to see it not just as a place, but as part of a story that had never truly ended. And Rex let out a single, soft bark from outside, and this time Ethan understood it clearly, not as a command or a signal, but as confirmation, as if the dog was telling him that this was it. This was what they had come for, and Ethan nodded slightly, a quiet gesture more to himself than to anything else, and he reached out once more, placing his hand gently between the two objects, bridging the space between them, and in that simple act there was closure, not finality, but a sense that something long separated had finally been brought back together, and the silence that followed was no longer heavy or uncertain. It was calm, settled, like the end of a long journey that had not been rushed but guided, step by step, through trust, through patience, and through a bond that had led them here, without ever needing to explain why. And as Ethan stood there, the light from the window shifted slightly, illuminating the table in a soft, steady glow, and for the first time since stepping into the forest that morning, he felt not just the weight of what had been found, but the quiet grace of having found it at all. The quiet inside the cabin did not feel empty anymore. It felt complete, like a sentence finally finished after years of being left unfinished, and Ethan remained standing by the table, his hand still resting lightly between the two objects, not holding them, not claiming them, just acknowledging their return to one another. And for a long moment he did not move, because there was nothing left to chase, nothing left to uncover, only something to understand, and that understanding did not come in words. It came in stillness, in the way the light settled across the wood, in the way the air no longer felt heavy but calm, as if whatever had lingered here had finally found its place again. And outside, Rex shifted once more, his nails brushing softly against the porch boards before he stepped closer to the door. And this time Ethan did not need to look to know what the dog was doing. He could feel it, that quiet presence drawing near, not out of urgency, but because the distance between them was no longer needed. And when Ethan finally turned and opened the door, the morning light poured in a little stronger, cutting through the dim interior in a warm, steady beam. And Rex stood there at the threshold, his posture relaxed now, his ears no longer fixed forward, his body no longer carrying that tight, searching energy. Instead, there was something softer in him, something settled, like a question that had finally been answered without needing to be spoken. And Ethan stepped aside, slightly, allowing him in, and Rex moved forward at an unhurried pace, crossing the worn floorboards until he reached the table, where he stopped and simply stood there, his head lowering just enough to take in the scent, not investigating, not searching, just acknowledging. And for a brief second he closed his eyes, a small, quiet gesture that carried more meaning than any action before it. And Ethan watched him, understanding now in a way he had not at the beginning, that this had never been about finding something lost. It had been about bringing something back, something that had waited long enough to be remembered. And he stepped closer, placing a gentle hand on Rex's back, feeling the steady warmth beneath his palm, grounding, real, and together they stood there in silence, the kind that did not need to be filled, because everything that needed to be said had already been spoken in the path that led them here. And after a moment, Ethan reached forward and adjusted the objects one final time, not changing them, just aligning them, leaving them where they belonged. And he knew then that this place would not remain hidden forever, that it would be documented, understood, perhaps even explained in ways that fit within reports and procedures. But none of that would ever fully capture what had happened here, what had guided them, what had brought them to this exact moment. And as he stepped back, giving the table its space, the room seemed to breathe once more, not with sound, but with presence. And Ethan felt something ease within him, something he had not realized was there until it was gone. And Rex turned toward the door again, not looking back this time, not needing to, and Ethan followed, stepping out into the open air where the forest and the road met in quiet balance. And the world felt unchanged yet different, as if something unseen had shifted just enough to be felt but not explained. And as they walked away from the cabin, the path ahead no longer felt uncertain. It felt simple, steady, like the kind of path you follow when there is nothing left to question, only something to carry with you. And Ethan glanced down at Rex briefly, and the dog met his gaze for just a second, calm, clear, And in that brief exchange, there was an understanding that did not belong to training or command. It belonged to something deeper, something that could not be taught, only lived. And as the distance between them and the cabin grew, the light stretched further across the ground, and the silence of the forest returned to its natural rhythm. And somewhere behind them, a story that had waited quietly for years had finally found its ending, not in words, but in the simple act of being remembered, and for Ethan, that was enough.